Hi everybody, it's Sarah Cray with Let's Make Art, and I teach watercolor, and now I'm going to teach you a little bit about gouache. And you might be confused on how to pronounce it. It rhymes with wash. So Keenan, can you demonstrate?
Gouache.
Thank you. I used to call it gouache.
Gouache.
And then someone corrected me. So, okay, a few things before we get into the meat of it that I want to take care of. One, you can use your watercolor supplies with gouache. You can use your palette tray, you can use a plastic palette tray, you can use your watercolor brushes. Just make sure that you rinse them really well when you're done, but you can absolutely use your watercolor brushes. If you notice that you're going to be using a lot of gouache and you really, really like gouache, then maybe separate them, just because gouache is a little bit harder on the brushes than watercolor. But if you kind of like dip your toe in here and there, you can use your same brushes, no problem. I'm going to be using Holbein Designer Gouache, which you can find at letsmakeart.com in this size here, which is a little bit bigger. It's a good size. I'm not going to talk about the different brands right now because I don't want to confuse you. I just want to do an intro to gouache. The other thing that you'll notice is we do sell, or you might have heard of, acrylic gouache. That is different than what I am showing you. I'm not going to go into the details of that one right now. I'm mostly just focusing on what gouache is and talking about how it compares to acrylic paint, how it compares to watercolor paint, okay? And the last thing that I want to just mention is I'm wearing my I'm Not Mad About It t-shirt. Because when we try new things, sometimes we get frustrated if it's not working for us right away, if we don't understand how to use it, we think we're doing something wrong, and it could be really stressful. So I'm here to remind you that this is fun. This is exploring, this is playtime, this is just getting used to it. So as you're playing with it, realize that your value is not tied up into how this is. This is going to be a really fun medium that I personally enjoy. Maybe you'll also love it, maybe you won't love it. That is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I just like to introduce you guys to new stuff because maybe it's like your thing and you just didn't know it yet.
Ooh, I like that.
You know?
Yeah.
So just a friendly reminder, don't be mad about it. Have fun with it. Play with me today, you guys. It's going to be great. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how gouache is different from acrylic paint, okay? And how it compares to it. So when you paint with acrylics or oils, you usually start with your darkest layers first, and then you build up. So you do your dark values, your mid values, then your light values, and your highlights, okay? Gouache can be used in that same way. That's the amazing thing about gouache, is you can approach it the way you would an acrylic painting or the way you would a watercolor painting, okay? There's just different techniques, and I'm gonna show you both of those, okay? So for example, let's say I'm starting with a white piece of paper, and with gouache you can paint on watercolor paper, you can paint on cardstock, you can paint on wood, you can paint on mixed media paper. Very versatile, so you can use whatever you have, okay? And I did a mixture of black and blue to do my dark gouache first, okay? Now when I build on top of this, I have to be careful about the amount of water that I am using. If I use too much water, it's not going to show up the same way acrylic would, okay? And I would also like to note too that if you're using your gouache paint similar to how you would acrylic, you're going to go through your paint very, very quickly. So just be mindful as you are doing your projects and the different things that you want to do, that you're not using all of your paint in the warm-ups, okay? I want you guys to play with me, but I also want you to like have enough paint to do your projects too. So now I just want to mention a few things before I show you guys. Now, gouache is water soluble, where acrylic is not water soluble. And what that means is it's reactivated with water. So if this were acrylic paint and it were dry, if I were to do water on top of it, it wouldn't move. It wouldn't do anything. But because this is gouache, if I were to take just water and paint an area, you see how that's lifting up?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Which is great. It's great for wanting to go back in there and stuff, but when you're doing layers, you have to be careful that your next layer with gouache has more paint than what was previously laid down, or else you're going to lift, okay? So what I'm saying, so what that means is if I were to do leaves, if I were to paint leaves on top of this, like a light blue leaf, with watercolor, I would just get my blue paint and mix it with water to get a light value. But if you do that on gouache, it's only going to show up because it's wet, and then when it dries, it's going to disappear. Okay? So it's not actually going to be a lighter value. You have to approach it as if you would more acrylic, which is I'm going to take some blue paint and I'm going to mix it with white. And if you have that mixture, then that is going to show up. So gouache is similar to acrylic in the way that you can layer it. It's opaque. If I paint something and I paint something on top of it, you're not going to see what's underneath there, okay? Now the other difference between acrylic and gouache is acrylic is made using a plastic agent as its binder, which is why it cannot reconstitute with water, and once it's dry, it's dry. Where gouache uses gum arabic for its binder, which is also what watercolor uses as its binder, which is why gouache is considered a watercolor or an opaque watercolor paint. It's basically watercolor paint mixed actually with white pigment, and that is what gives it its opaque look, which is wonderful because it gives us a lot of versatility. Because it's so versatile, it can be confusing on how to use it. So that is why I'm doing this video, and hopefully it helps, okay? So the other difference between acrylic and gouache is the finish. There are different kinds of acrylic paints, but most of the time there's a sheen to it, or a glare, glossy finish, that kind of stuff. This gouache, or gouache in general, has a very matte finish, very smooth, like velvet and kind of chalky, which is actually really wonderful if you're trying to make reproductions, because when you're scanning or taking photographs of it, it's not going to have a sheen that the light catches, right? So this is a very popular medium with people who paint posters or who take photographs of their work for like magazines, or illustrators who do a lot of digital scans and reproductions, because that scanner can pick up the opaque washes and there's not a glare to them, okay? So I'm just going to keep on painting on top of it. Now if you start to get a rough texture, like see how it's kind of rough right there, I'm going to grab a little bit more water to kind of like smooth out that finish. Now I kind of want to show you that the amount of water is going to inform you on how opaque your layers are going to be. So if I want to make sure that it's like full opaqueness. Is that a word? Sure.
Yes.
Yes. Then I'm going to make sure I have a lot of paint. Okay? And you're not going to see anything through that. You can't see that background behind it. But if I were to kind of do a little bit more water with my paint, and I were to paint on top of it, it's going to show through more. You see that?
Yep.
Okay? So you can kind of play with that. But just know that if you have a lot of water, this was our leaf that we painted with mostly water and a tiny bit of paint. So really utilize that white paint that you have if you're trying to make a lighter value, okay? So to recap, acrylic and gouache are both opaque and they both can be layered, but they have different binding agents, which means the gouache reconstitutes with water, so you can bring it back up with water, or you can also mix it in with water a little bit easier and have a smoother finish as opposed to acrylic. Also, gouache has a chalky, matte finish, very smooth, very soft, very velvety, where acrylic tends to have a shiny, maybe plastic or glossy finish. Okay?
Check.
Now we're going to talk about how gouache compares to watercolor. So, with gouache and watercolor, they are both binded using gum arabic, okay? Which means you can mix water with them and they reconstitute with water. Now I want to show you right here, this is gouache added with water. So you can see that I can get a watercolor feel and look to it, which is really fabulous and really versatile. It's not going to do as much in terms of if you do like the wet on wet technique, it's not going to like move as much. So it's not going to create as many exciting textures as watercolor would. But the great thing about doing this with watercolor is you can build up your light washes and watercolor washes to this point, actually. So I'm going to demonstrate that. So here I've got my washes with gouache. And then the nice thing with this too is even though they're kind of transparent, if I were to like scan this, it actually would show up even a little bit better than watercolor would, because I wrote this down. It sits on top of the paper as opposed to sinking into the paper. So yeah, where watercolor, especially with like cotton papers, it sinks into that and that cotton paper absorbs that water.
Whoa.
Okay, so here I'm doing another layer. This is gouache mixed with some water. So there is some transparency here, and this is the fun thing about it, is you can then decide how you want your painting to look. Do I want these light washes that kind of have a little bit of transparency to them, or do I want them to be fully opaque? And you guys get to make that decision simply by how much water you're using and how much paint you're using.
Those are some good looking leaves.
I always do leaves. Leaves are like my go-to thing when I'm testing colors, when I'm testing brushes, when I'm testing paints, because they're just pretty.
Kind of remind me of eyes.
It took me a second to understand what you were saying. Okay, now when it comes to gouache versus watercolor, gouache tends to have more pigment in the paint, so it's highly, highly pigmented. And you can layer it with because it's opaque. So that's like the main difference here is if I wanted to, like in watercolor, this is a pretty dark value in watercolor. I would say mid to dark. But I can go on top of that with gouache.
I love that green color.
Yeah, that's so good. That's black and what blue is this? Primary cyan and a little bit of yellow, I think. So this, I'm making sure I have more paint on my brush than water. Okay, so I kind of want you guys to play with this, play with how you would layer this. Try and approach it as if you would watercolor. So this, I just went with a darker value but had more water, so it's more transparent, to kind of like show you guys the difference of how versatile this can be. So there is some transparency in there, which of course is great. We like transparency, we like layers. It doesn't have to be though if you don't want it to be. Okay, so, and this is where gouache gets super exciting, you guys, because let's say, like if this were watercolor, like I would not be able to paint anything on top of these leaves and have it show because it's transparent, right? Because this is such a dark value, I basically would be stuck using this value if I wanted it to even be seen, and it would have to be darker, right? With gouache, I can take blue and I could take white to make a lighter value. And using that lighter value, I can paint right over that super dark one. So this is kind of like the fun magical thing about it is you can just keep on layering. You can keep on painting. And it covers. You see how it's just covering that dark?
Yes.
And this is still even a little bit wet. If I were to let that dark green dry a little bit more, it would cover it even more. So you can just layer and layer and layer and layer. But again, you want to be careful about how much water is in your layers, because we don't want to have this kind of problem where, you know, we're building up, we have lots of layers, and we use mostly water for our next layer, because it's not going to show up. It's actually just going to lift, okay? Now, I want to make sure, I'm going through my notes to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. But this is where it gets exciting too, because on both of these, I can go back into both of these and add a dark layer on top of these leaves. I can do a lighter layer on top of these leaves. So if I wanted to do, let's say I decide to go back into this one and do like a dark place where it meets the vine for like depth or whatever. I can do that. Just paint right on top of it. So you can start dark and then do a light painting. Just make sure you have white in there to make it lighter, and then do dark again. So you can go back and forth a little bit. Okay. Or this one, I can do that with this one. Do dark, detail lines, or I could do highlights. So with gouache, we are utilizing our white paint more and relying on it more to create lighter values, whereas watercolor, we're mostly utilizing the water for that, okay? So that's where it really is different, and I need you guys to be aware of that, is for me, because I'm so used to watercolor, I just want to dip my brush in water all of the time when it comes to blending, when it comes to doing lighter colors, when it comes to all of this. With gouache, we can't necessarily do that. And as we go through our gouache projects, you'll see, but I just want you to give you a heads up. I don't want you to get frustrated on that. Don't be mad at gouache for being what it is. You know what I mean? Appreciate it for all of its different wonderful things that you can do with it. Okay. Now, the other really great thing, and I just want to show this to you really quick, is you can paint on dark surfaces with gouache because it's opaque, which is like super fun. So if you wanted to use black paper, this is Legion black paper. Just make sure that you have a good amount of paint and not too much water, and you can paint right on top of that. So you can either use like colored or toned paper, or you can paint a background yourself, like I did with this one, and then paint on top of that.
I love that blue.
Yeah, that's a good blue. And I just want to show you, I mean, I haven't really tried this. I'm going to mix a lot of water into this because I just want to see how it shows up on the black paper. So this is that same blue color, just watered down. So it's showing up pretty good, and I'm interested to see what it looks like when it dries. Okay, we're gonna let that dry. So, to recap, gouache and watercolor are both water-based paints, and they use gum arabic as their binding agent, and they reconstitute with water. The difference is that gouache can be more opaque when you layer it and have more paint on it. Watercolor, you're really limited in how much you can do for layering because everything is so transparent, okay? And then I have a couple tips for you guys that I learned along the way. Just fun little tips.
Pro tips.
Pro tips. 1, This paint does reconstitute, but when it's on your palette and it's totally dry, you can bring it back with water, but it's a little bit more difficult to control the opacity because you have to add water just to bring it back, which in itself is going to lighten the paint a little bit. So try and work out of the tube if you can. You'll have an easier time controlling the amount of opacity if you do that. But don't waste the paint either. So sometimes what I do is if I have too much paint on my tray, like if I'm done, look at all of this paint that I have left.
Yeah.
Next time I come to it, I can use this paint as a bottom layer, or I can use it if I'm going to approach it the way I would a watercolor painting, which is doing transparent layers first. It's easier to do that with the with these dried paints. Okay.
Oh, smart.
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 The other thing is that gouache tends to dry really, really quickly. So if you're starting to get frustrated because you want to blend and it's just drying and it's not mixing, keep a spray bottle by you and you can just mist your painting.
What?
Yes, I know. And if you're smoothing it out and doing washes and layering of washes like that and you're okay with things kind of blending, then the water bottle won't, the misting won't be an issue. But it's a great way to keep things moist.
That's amazing.
So
Sorry
keep
for
that.
interrupting.
I'm glad you're excited about that tip. I hope that helps
That
you.
is so cool.
Yeah, because sometimes I get frustrated with gouache because it dries so quickly and I'm like, man, I'm just trying to blend one color into this color and it's not blending anymore because this side is dry and I didn't work fast enough. Keep a little spray bottle, mist it, you're good to go. The last thing is just re-emphasizing what we talked about first, which is you want to build up your layers starting from lighter. If you're going to add water to it, do lighter washes and then build up, similar to what we would in watercolor. If you're going to approach it with acrylic where you're starting with your darks first, you want to make sure that you're building up and matching the amount of water or doing more paint than water as you build up so you don't actually take away from the painting underneath. Okay, so the first ways that you approach your painting are really informative on how it's going to go. So if you want to make sure that you start transparent and you start light and build up that way, add a lot of water and build up. If you want to start dark, then you gotta like start and use mostly paint for that painting. But another hint, you go through this paint really quick if you're just like using it that way and not watering it down. So again, we have multiple gouache projects that you are going to refer to that come out in September. And we're gonna kind of go through all of these different scenarios in this project. But I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of background information on how to use this. And I think that's all I gotta say. I'm really excited for you guys to play with this. I love this medium because of how versatile it is. It really gives me the freedom to like cover mistakes. It gives me the freedom to use it like a watercolor or use it like an acrylic paint or both and meshing those together. So it's super fun, super pigmented, very vibrant. Love the matte chalky finish, very smooth. I love being able to paint on different surfaces. It really is a lot of fun. I hope you guys enjoy it. I can't wait to show you what else you can do with it. And thank you guys for painting with me. Bye.